Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Pharmacist Real Estate Investing Podcast, a show all about empowering pharmacists to achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. I'm Nate Hedrick, and each week, my co-host David Bright and I explore stories from pharmacists all over the country who are achieving their real estate goals while maintaining a meaningful career in pharmacy. Whether you're a first-time investor or a seasoned pro, we're here to provide education and inspiration about the world of real estate. Please note, this podcast is intended for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial or investment advice. Hey, David, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks. How you doing, man?
I am good. I am in the perpetual rehab still, but I'm almost done. It's wrapping up. I feel like I keep saying that, but it is good. I was at the house twice today, but it's coming along, so.
Nice. We've got one that we're hoping to close on in the next few days. It's one of those where the closing date shifts a little bit here and there. I'm sure you know how that goes right now. So yeah, my mind is locked on to getting that project off to a good start. We've had a realtor that has helped us to get this one to the finish line. Again, I'm learning more and more how much goes on behind the scenes of a realtor trying to get a property closed when there's hiccups with probate and all those kind of things. And yeah, all that goes into that. So I'm sure you're well acquainted with a lot of those details and drama.
Yeah, I tell my clients I am really good at bugging people, right? Like I'm constantly just like poking all the right bears to keep the thing moving to the finish line. And inspections, financing, title, I mean, you name it. Like we've got to keep all that stuff communicating. And it just, if we're doing our job right, you're never going to see it. It's all going on in the background. So now you get to experience a little yourself there, David.
Yeah. It's fun to watch. And at the same time, there's so much that I appreciate working with realtors that help that whole process. One thing that I've learned too is to keep an eye on like, okay, once the baton is passed to me, like literally when the keys come across the closing table, right? Like when I literally get the keys and it's literally mine, to try to get that off on the right start as well, because that's another big pivot point in that process.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, as an agent, that's one of my favorite moments is that seeing the joy on our clients' faces as we get to the closing table. They're about to get that house, and it's a great time. It's really why I do this. But I've also been the guy buying the property and thought, okay, here we go. Like now we got to get started. Everything kicks off from here. Like you said, it's a big pivot point.
Yeah. And I've even seen, and I've talked with a couple different people recently that have got the keys, and like, rather than like, cause we all expect that joy and everybody has that joy for some period of time. But then like for both of them, they called me when like panic set in of like, oh, wait, what's next? So there is that big list of things that has to be done like on closing day or very, very quickly thereafter. And so we thought that this would be a good episode as we're both kind of in that, you're wrapping up, I'm getting started, as we're both kind of in that process of what are those things that need to happen right before and then right at closing day.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a great concept. I think the movie perception, if that's a thing, or the TV show perception of like closing day is just you show up to the bank, there's a lawyer there or like a closing person of some type, and then you sign a document, they hand you the keys and you move right into the house. But that's not exactly what it looks like. And so I think it's important to walk through that and understand what that process does.
Yeah. And so that's one of those things. Again, we talk about how every few episodes we slow down and we do these deep dives where we dig into a topic that's been brought up here and there in the podcast, but never in great depth. So we thought this is the time to dive into this so that when you get keys handed to you across the closing table, it isn't panic, but it's like, okay, I'm on it. Let's go. So we thought for today's episode, we'll start off leaning on Nate, the realtor, to take us up to the point of closing. And then I'll come in with the kind of new owner. What is that checklist for closing day or that very shortly after? So Nate, I know you've seen people that have that pre-approval letter in hand. They got the list of properties they want to see. They're super excited to get started on the process and get an offer accepted. So can you walk us through just a little bit of that behind the scenes that you're talking about, the things that people aren't always in the loop with? What goes on? What are those key milestones in the process to get a property purchased?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep this like 10,000 foot view, right? But there are a couple of key steps that take place that I think will start to outline what that process looks like. And I know when I'm tracking things on my own, like I have a CRM that I use to track our clients and how they're going through the process. And so there's like 6 steps to how I actually track it. So step 1 is obviously the offer acceptance. This is when you've written an offer, you've put an offer on a property, the seller of that property says, yes after negotiations or without and says, yes, we're going to go with you. We're under contract, right? You've probably heard that term before. You're under contract on a property. And that's really once you get an offer accepted. And from there, the clock sort of starts, right? There's a bunch of things that have to take place, but that all kind of begins with that offer acceptance.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about that too? Because one of the things that I've come to understand through going through this process is that I thought this was one of those things where people get on the phone and they like negotiate it all through. But in addition to being on the phone, there is a written piece to this where the buyer may have to sign documents along the way. And there could be some language in there that the buyer would have to be familiar with. So can you walk us through what that means as far as that negotiation process?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's different in every state. But generally speaking, what this is going to look like is that you're writing up effectively a purchase agreement. You're saying these are the conditions under which we're purchasing this property, things like price, things like closing date, all the important aspects that detail what the process is going to look like. It's all written out. And then you as the buyer and the seller, both parties have to sign that document. In fact, both agents need to sign that document as well. And we're going to use that purchase agreement to make all of our decisions moving forward. So nothing happens outside of that purchase agreement without an addendum or some sort of formal change. So everything is done in writing and everything is signed by both parties. And that really is the plan for how you're going to move forward.
And as a pharmacist that likes clarity,
yes,
I like that part of the process, right? Like it's in writing. We can go back to those documents and know exactly what's coming and exactly what's going on. One of those key aspects that I know hits a lot of people is that inspection period and any kind of inspection clause in the process. So can you talk a little bit about that inspection part of the process as well?
Yeah, and that really is kind of the second step in this cascade, right? So offer acceptance, then inspections. And so typically what we have is a window of time where those inspections are allowed to take place. And we detail the type of inspections that we're going to perform. So this might be as simple as just a general home inspection, or it might include things like a radon test or termite inspection or sewer camera inspection. Like you name it, you can do it. But really, you have a window of time in which to complete your inspections. And then it's another decision point. You can basically use that inspection result to do one of three things in most cases. Again, it'll vary based on your contract and your location, but in general, you can either accept things as they are, right? You use the inspection and say, yep, everything's good, or everything that's not good, we're going to handle ourselves. And you basically waive your contingency and you keep moving down the path. The other option is you can go back to the sellers. You can renegotiate. You can say, hey, we found that the furnace is on its last legs. We want you to help us pay for that, cover half the cost of replacing it or whatever, right? You can renegotiate. Or three, you can ask them to go back and fix things. So sometimes it's price, sometimes it's actually fixing things. So, hey, we noticed that X, Y, and Z is broken. We'd like those to be repaired. They're a safety hazard. So before we close, we need you to get those things fixed. And there are nuances. There are other ways you can negotiate within that inspection window. But basically, those are the ways that you can handle inspections. And if you don't want to do any of those things, you can walk away. You can use your inspection contingency to say, all right, based on what we found from our professional, we're not going to continue with this deal and we're going to have to walk away from it.
That makes good sense. And it feels like one of those safety steps that I think pharmacists are drawn to is that inspection where a professional goes through and finds those things that could potentially be wrong with a house. I know when I had a inspection, one of the first houses that we bought, it struck me a little bit that sometimes in these inspections, it's you need to have a licensed or qualified person check this out. Like if there's something really major, like a foundation, or maybe your furnace example, like you may want to have a qualified HVAC contractor check out this furnace or something like that. So is that something that you may do as well to potentially have other people come lay eyes on a house as well?
Definitely. And there's a cost to doing that, right? So as the buyer, you're paying for that in almost all instances. But let's say your inspector comes through and they don't inspect roofs, right? Most are not roofing inspectors, right? They're qualified home inspectors, but they don't have the expertise in roofing. Well, they can say, I think that roof is having some issues, or I'm seeing signs of leaking from the roof. You probably need to have a qualified roofer come out and take a look at this property. You'll see that often in an inspection report, and then you can kind of gauge with your agent and with your inspector, how serious is this? Do I need to have somebody come back out and take a look? So that's absolutely a part of that process. And keep in mind, you need to make sure that before you're writing an offer, you really take the time to sit down with your agent and understand what the inspection contingency looks like, right? Again, I say this a lot of times, but it's different in every state. I've worked with clients in other states where sometimes you don't get this many choices, right? You might have to do it by a certain rule set based on the local municipality or the local Association of Real Estate Agents. So make sure you talk with your agents about, hey, if we do this and this happens or we get a bad inspection, what are our options and what does that look like? Because it can really make sure that you're taking the right steps up front to protect yourself.
No, I like that a lot. And that is hugely important to make sure that you're protected, especially the safety-oriented pharmacist. So one of the other steps in the process that involves a little bit of protection there, particularly if you are getting a mortgage on the property, then is the appraisal. Is that the next step in the process?
It is, yeah. And it's working alongside the inspection, actually. This is all going on kind of at the same time as the inspection. So once you get that offer accepted, you're going to get your scheduled inspection. You're also going to schedule an appraisal with your lender, where basically your lender is going to send out a representative from the bank. That representative is a qualified or a licensed appraiser that does not work for the bank. They are hired by the bank. They are an independent contractor, basically, that goes out and they evaluate the property. They determine what the property is worth based on market value. And again, this is a key point I should have made up front. This is only if you're getting a loan through a lender, right? If you're buying all cash, you wouldn't have an appraisal. But basically, if you're getting a loan, that appraiser is going to come out, evaluate the property, and they're going to provide what's called an opinion of value back to the bank. So if I'm buying a house for $200,000, I need a loan to get me to that $200,000 mark. The appraiser is going to come out, evaluate the property, and hopefully it appraises for at least $200,000, because if it doesn't, then all of a sudden the bank is not going to want to loan or lend to me, at least not enough to cover that full amount, right? So if it appraises at $190,000, there's a $10,000 gap there where the bank doesn't feel like it's worth what you're saying you're willing to pay. So that appraisal is super important because it drives what the bank is willing to lend to you.
Yeah, and I feel like this is one of those behind the scenes moments too, because my experience is that I give a lot of the information to my realtor about who the lender is and those kind of things. And then as far as like the precise scheduling and things like that you mentioned, on the buyer side, I don't see much of that. That's probably much more of a realtor task. So one of those behind the scenes where you're poking people to make sure things get done. I'm imagining that the same is about the title work. That's a part of the process I'm very minimally involved in as a buyer, but can you share a little bit about what's going on in the title side?
Yeah. So while the appraisal and the inspection's going on, you're also having the title company work through the title itself. So that's who owns the property currently. Are there any liens placed against the property, meaning someone that property owner owes money to? Are the right people actually selling the property? So let's say you had a husband and wife that own the property together and they get divorced. Is the appropriate legal person selling the property? Are all the parties aware that need to be aware? All of this work is going on in the background through a title agency to make sure that at the closing table, when we go to transfer title from the current owner to the person buying it, that we're able to actually do that, right? That the county or whoever is going to allow that to take place. So that work is all going on in the background. A lot of times agents will get questions throughout from the title agency to make sure that the right I's are being dotted and T's are being crossed. But that's all going on in the background throughout this entire process.
Yeah, that, again, one of those many things that I think is going on that I'm not seeing. Another one seems to be, along with the title work, the loan, all the inspections, everybody that, particularly in the case of a rental, maybe even transfer security deposit and all those things, there's a lot of just financial pieces moving around and a lot of just kind of complex Tetris there that ends up in some final numbers. So how does that work? How do you work with a buyer to make sure the numbers are right? Like, how does that process play out?
Yeah, so right before closing, whenever you got your closing date scheduled, a couple of days before, about 5 days or so before closing, you're going to start to get closing disclosures from your lender or from the title company, usually a combination of both. And what that is basically your disclosure of what you're going to be paying at the closing table. So it's going to include things like your down payment, any taxes that you might owe, fees you have to pay to the bank or to the title company. All that, it gets incorporated into a big document and you get a certain amount of time to review that. So here in Ohio, we have a 72-hour closing disclosure window. Basically, you have to provide a closing disclosure to the buyer and then give them 72 hours to review that before everyone can go to closing. And what that looks like is that you're basically establishing these are the numbers, and we want to make sure that you are comfortable with all these numbers. This is what you're buying it for. These are the fees that you're paying. This is the down payment, the interest rate, so on and so forth. And all that is basically established right up into the closing date.
Okay, so it starts off with getting an offer accepted. There's inspections that come in there. There's an appraisal if there's a loan. There's title work going on in the background. The final numbers that the realtor, the loan officer, everybody's putting together.
The actual closing, right? We get to finally do it and transfer title. And it's different in every state. Again, I keep saying that, but some states require you to close with a lawyer. Some states still do what's called a roundtable closing, where the seller and the buyer get together and do it at the same place. Other states like Ohio, we can have sellers and buyers closing on totally different days and different locations, and they never meet each other. It all depends on where you're at. But effectively, there's really two things that you're doing. One is you're closing on the loan, right? You're closing on the actual financing of that property, who's paying for it. And two, you're closing on the title work. You're closing on who owns the property. And so both of those things are very different. And so again, I think the kind of a storybook feel of what this looks like is like it's one signature, you get the keys and you walk out. But there's actually a myriad of paperwork that goes into this. It's easily a half an hour worth of just signing things. And what you're doing is, again, closing on those two pieces of the puzzle, the loan itself, and then the actual property title in terms of who owns that. And so both of those things need to take place before you can actually have the keys. And in a lot of states, the title has to actually transfer before you can get possession, meaning you close, you sign everything, you leave, you go do whatever you want for a couple of hours, and you wait for the county to actually transfer that title into your name. And that can take anywhere from, again, a couple of hours to even another day. And a lot of people assume closing table equals the day I get my keys, but that might not always be the case.
So you need to check with your realtor in your state then to see if you can really go to that property and key in right afterwards, if you need to wait a day or two, or how that works to make sure that you're not trespassing, even though you've already signed documents or things like that.
Yeah, the important things to ask are, what's my closing date and what is our possession date? And those are two different things. And if you ask that, you'll have a pretty good idea of what that looks like.
Good deal. So then that's the point at which you are sitting at the closing table with the person buying the property. They have both that joy and then that like instant fear for things that are coming next, right?
Yeah, so that's perfect, David. It's a good transition because I'm going to flip the fear questions back to you, right? So we've closed on the property now. We're at the closing table and we've done all that. The keys are now in your hands, right? So we've gotten that transition to take place. But David, once you get the keys in hand, what are the first few things that you should be doing right after closing? And again, especially talking about investment property, those first few days are really crucial in terms of what you're going to be doing with those keys and with this new property that you're just taking on. So I want to jump into that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because there's some things that happen right away. There's even a few things that should happen a few days prior to closing that you need to do on your end as well. And I think that a couple of the things there that you want to make sure you don't forget before you go to closing table would be thinking about insurance, thinking about utility transfers, and maybe even doing a final pre-closing walkthrough of the property to make sure that the property is still in the condition that you were expecting it to be in.
Yeah, and those are all things that, again, we would recommend to our clients as well, to make sure you're following the contract in terms of, are you allowed to have a closing walkthrough? When do the utilities need to start calling? All those things should be laid out pretty carefully. That's a great point.
With the walkthrough, I think that can be a very important thing, particularly if the property is vacant. You never know if there's a break-in or something that would go undetected or a burst pipe or something like that. I mean, things you would hope would never happen, but by walking through shortly before closing, so it can be an important thing to make sure that you put into that purchase agreement, particularly on a vacant property. The utility transfers, yes, absolutely. In some areas, you can even call ahead to make sure that those transfer on the day of closing. So assuming that that closing date is set, the day before or something, you can call in to schedule those kind of things. So that can be one less thing to deal with on the day of closing. And then the property insurance as well. It may take a few days to get the property insurance handled. And particularly if there's a loan on the property, that's probably something that the lender is going to require. And they're not going to clear the loan to close without insurance. If you are making a cash purchase, it's something that you don't technically always need. But I mean, again, as a safety-oriented pharmacist, it feels like a wise thing to have insurance on a major purchase like that. So that can be something to make sure you set up in advance and to make sure you clarify with your insurance agent the purpose, whether it's vacant or tenanted, and all those kind of details to make sure you get the right kind of insurance that you need.
That totally threw me on my first property that we bought in cash. It took me like 2 full weeks to realize that I need to go get insurance ready, because again, the lender's usually the one bugging me about it. Like, Nate, who's your insurance agent? Make sure they contact me and make sure they contact title. Again, I was like, oh yeah, we need to get insurance on this place. So been there, missed that. Again, luckily we didn't close without it, but I'd forgotten about it up front. So good reminder.
When so many of these parts of the process are often managed by a realtor that's done this a bunch of times and they know this inside and out, they make sure all those T's are crossed and I's are dotted. Yeah, easy things to miss, bad things to miss.
All right. So great reminders of things to do right before closing. But what about, again, once you've got those keys in hand, what are the kind of the key next steps for you?
Yeah, I think that the tempting thing is to go to the property and just start like checking it out. But I think one of the important things to do is make sure that you've packed the car for that initial trip and you're taking things to the property that you need. Like the first thing that I think of is a lock set and a lock box, so that you can go to the property and you can rekey the property. And if you want to have a locksmith or a contractor do that, absolutely, that's fine. If you want to be adventurous on YouTube, changing locks on a property is not the hardest thing. Like I am very, very not handy. I think I've said that several times now on the podcast. I'm very not handy, but changing out locks, like changing a deadbolt and changing a doorknob, like not the hardest thing. It's something you could probably learn on YouTube. So having box cutters and a screwdriver and things like that to get in and do that, and then to hang a lockbox so that assuming that you're not going to be doing all the work yourself, that there may at some point be someone delivering materials or a contractor that needs access, having a lockbox at the property can be really helpful if you're not going to be there all the time. And in the case of an investment property, you're probably not going to be there all the time.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much a lockbox has just saved me time and effort, especially if something silly like, hey, there's a contractor, he wants to walk through, get an estimate on this thing. If it's somebody I know and trust, and even sometimes even if it's just I need to get it done, right? It's easy to throw them the lockbox code and then let them go walk the property and take care of it. That way I don't have to drive over there and all that stuff. So it's a great tip.
Yeah, it becomes a super simple strategy. And I know that there can be some heartburn associated if you have a lot of people walking the house, right? And then, a lot of people could have had that key or that thing. But the lock boxes are really easy to change codes throughout the project too. If you are nervous about that, if you had a bunch of bids from contractors you've never met, or if you're just worried about how many people may know the code, you can always change it. You can always rekey the house again. It's not very expensive relative to everything else that goes on. So very simple to rekey the property and hang a lockbox.
You could also get fancy too. If you're installing new deadbolts and new locks anyway, you can get one of those electronic locks, which allows you to set multiple codes for multiple individuals, right? So you can have a contractor code or just a painter code. Like you can really get creative with that if you want to go that route.
Yeah, absolutely. I think related to that is one of the other things that I know some investors do, some investors don't do, but that's setting an alarm system. There's a lot of portable alarm systems that you can get that are not terribly expensive if you want a couple doors, a couple windows, and a motion sensor kind of thing, and even some non-contract based, some short-term time limited contracts for monitoring that you can set up so that there can be automatic calls to police. And so we've done that at properties over time too. That's also nice, particularly if there's not going to be someone there every day and you are worried about some of those vacancy issues. An alarm system can be another, just one of those safety things that pharmacists may appreciate.
Great tip. What about anything that your insurance might require? Is there anything that, because I know you talked about that in the past, anything that you recommend in terms of what your insurance would want you to be doing?
Yeah, I think a tip I was given early on is to also in that first trip over, when you're packing the key set, the lock set, the lock box, also pack a fire extinguisher to make sure there's a fire extinguisher at the property. And you can ask your insurance agent what would be required, but many insurance policies may require there to be a fire extinguisher there at the property. You may want to go through and make sure that the doors are locked. I know one thing that we run into from time to time is sliding doors to the exterior. The locks may not always work super well, or really they're not the most protective. And so some people will bring broomstick and cut it, or a 2x4 and cut it to put in the track to make sure that that sliding door is a little more secure. Another thing that we've run into in a property that's been vacant for a minute is we'll walk in and we'll hear that chirping of the smoke detectors
Right.
that are on low batteries, right? So just
Classic.
having a pack of 9-volt batteries or a pack of AA batteries or whatever it takes just in a toolbox somewhere that you can change those out, because about 10 minutes into the property where it's chirping every 30 seconds, like that gets real old real fast.
I feel like that's a TikTok video waiting to happen, right? Tell me you're an investor without telling me you're an investor, and it's just a bunch of 9-volt batteries in your car. I like it.
Yes, for real. And the lockbox in the glove box. Absolutely. Yeah.
It's perfect. What about getting ready for the rehab? Because I know, especially a lot of your properties, David, are a lot of properties that you buy and then fix up right away. So what about other things to kind of speed that along? Because holding costs are not irrelevant. And so what are things that you do to really keep that process moving and get off on the right foot?
if I'm the one doing the initial walkthrough after purchase, one of the things that I'll try to do is I'll make sure that in addition to the lock set, the lock box, the fire extinguisher, the other things, I've also got a tape measure with me and a roll of that blue painter's tape, because I will try to get a bunch of measurements of anything I might need. So if I'm measuring countertops, or if I'm measuring amount of flooring we would need, or measuring like whatever we would need, I'm trying to get as many measurements as I can. And I'll even just use my phone to take a picture of the tape measure stretched out. So I've got clear records of everything that we may need to order. I'll get a lot of pictures and even just a quick video of walkthrough so that we have a good idea of layout, then anything we may have missed. Like one of the things that I'm really consistent at missing is like number of windows in a house so that I can order the right number of curtains. But if you do a quick walkthrough video, you can always go back through that and just count how many windows and how many curtains you may need. Those kind of things there. It's really frustrating to not have those records, particularly if you don't live super close to the property. You've got to make another trip out just to figure something like that out. So that first set of measurements and pictures can be really important.
Yeah, that's a great tip, and something that, again, like you said, if you don't live super close by, and even if you do, you don't want to just spend time going back and forth to the property. So anything you can do to make that a little more efficient is going to help you save time, save money, and just save effort.
Yeah, I've also found you can clear up a lot of miscommunications early on. That's why I have that roll of blue tape. Like I'll oftentimes put tape on something that we're demoing. Like if there's a bathroom vanity that's coming out, I'll use tape. I'll put like remove, on the tape so that that's clear. And then if there's something we're keeping, I'll put like keep on that. So just to make very, very clear, because over or under demo is a real problem. We want to make sure that some of those things are right.
That reminds me of the time that we hired the contractors to junk out that place, David, and they trashed the security system that we put in like the day before. That was pretty terrible.
Yes.
We should have written some blue tape on that. I feel like we missed our chance.
Right. Just taping that like, yes, no, this stays. This is not trash. There was just so much trash in that house. It was easy to assume that everything in that house was trash.
But the only new bright, shiny thing, don't throw that away. Come on, people.
Yeah.
Well, again, these are great tips, David. Any last parting thoughts before we wrap things up here?
I think one other thing that I might throw in just that's hopefully unique to our season of life right now with some of the supply chain issues is in the initial inspection period, we'll even do a little bit of this where we'll try to get that walkthrough video and try to get a few measurements and try to get a few things ordered. For instance, if you're trying to get flooring or windows right now, like that may take a minute. So trying to order that in advance. And then if by chance during that 21, 28, 45 day, whatever that period is between when you put the offer in and when you get the keys, if you've been able to order and get those things in, then even dropping those things off at the property. If you're the kind of person that manages materials for your team or even just certain things for your team, it can be, if you're trying to save trips and save time, trying to knock that out all at once so that you're dropping off materials at the property when you go there for that first time.
I love it. It drives more efficiency. It's great. Well, this can feel like a lot, but I think it's nice to break it down into these different steps. And again, as long as you prep in advance and start to think about these things, because not all this has to be done the hour after you close, right? This can all be prepped in advance, and then it's a much easier process once you've actually closed, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. If you go through to the hardware store and get the lockbox and the lock set and the blue tape and the like whatever else you may need, that can all be done exactly like you said, a week or more in advance. So you've got that in your trunk and it's one less stressful thing on closing day to worry about, that you can go there, you can work your plan, execute your plan, and be off to the races with your project.
Yeah, I need to work on getting more efficient with that. On our last house, I had the lockbox and the locksmith on his way, and that was like all I had prepped. And I was like, oh man, I should have been doing this in advance. I needed this episode like 4 months ago. So this is great.
But it's easy to do. And even other things too, just as you are looking at properties, mental notes to make like, oh, that's a great paint color. I'd love to have that in the house. Just making notes of that so that when it comes time, like you've already got that ready to execute.
And keep in mind, if our episode today has made you more stressed than less, right, we can help with that. So not only are we here for you guys in the Facebook group, the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group, we've also got a guide that details a lot of this stuff and goes through some of the basics. And again, it gives you an opportunity to reach out to us if you need to. So go to our website, yfprealestate.com. You can download the guide. And heck, you could even just re-listen to this episode a week before closing and make sure you got this final checklist ready to go. So we definitely know you can do this. Don't get overwhelmed by the checklist. Live in the checklist. Be a good detail-oriented pharmacist. Be nerdy like us, and I promise you'll feel better about it.
I think another thing that can help, because absolutely, we are not trying to make this sound any more complicated than it needs to, but if you're struggling with any of these kind of decisions or questions about parts of the process, you're trying to figure out like, what is the difference between vacant and tenant insurance, or why would I want to rip out this vanity or keep this vanity? If you're just struggling with those details, like a detail-oriented pharmacist might, another place to go for advice and even just camaraderie is the YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. It's a great place to post questions and get suggestions and have other pharmacists come alongside of you to help you in your real estate investing journey as well.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you at the closing table. Best of luck.
Thanks for listening to the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. If you like what you heard on today's show, please leave us a review and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. If you have a question, know someone that would make a good guest, or want to connect with Nate or David, head on over to yfprealestate.com and join the growing YFP Real Estate Investing Facebook group. As we conclude this week's episode of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided to you for your informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on this podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist, unless otherwise noted, and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you for your support of the YFP Real Estate Investing Podcast. Have a great rest of your week.